The Empire of Orenix had never lost a war, not because of ships, because of stories. They wrote history like it was iron, sealed, unchallengeable. Every rebel was a villain, every massacre a mercy, and those who dared remember otherwise, buried, raced, forgotten, until someone came, not a general, not a god, just one man. He carried no fleet, no sword, no weapon at all, only a story. He told it once, and the empire began to fall. The transport vessel drifted into orbit over Orynyx Prime without warning. No military signature, no escort, no registry. It bore no flag, just dust on its hull and a signal code not used in 1,000 years. The capital's orbital authority paused for only a moment. Curiosity won over protocol. They cleared it to land. It descended slow, graceful despite age. Dock workers gathered, expecting cargo. Troops, traders. What emerged was a man, alone. Dust clung to his boots and robes. He carried no weapons, no devices, only an old leather-bound book tucked under one arm. He offered no identification, just a single request. "Let me speak to your storytellers." They laughed at first. Security scanned him. He triggered no alerts, no cybernetic enhancements, no record in any Dominion archive, no heat signature strong enough to match any known species. Still, he breathed. Still, he waited. He was not detained. He was not welcomed. He was observed. Curiosity again triumphed. A delegate from the Lore Master's court agreed to meet him. As novelty, nothing more. The Court of Lore Masters was not a government. It held no armies, passed no laws. It was older than either. Its members were scholars, poets, historians, the keepers of memory in a civilization addicted to forgetting. They gathered in the third vault beneath the Orynyx spire, where even whispers were preserved and crystal and dust was treated like ink. When the man entered, they studied him with quiet amusement. No title, no ceremony, no pomp, only presence. He bowed his head and opened the book. It contained no language known to the Orynyx, but its pages breathed as he turned them, each word etched in light. Some glowed red, some pulsed blue, some wept. The lore masters leaned in, not to read, to listen. For the book did not tell a story, it let them feel one. The man spoke softly. "This is not mine. It was carried, generation to generation. I was merely the last to survive the journey." A young archivist asked, "Survive what?" The man smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, just knowingly. "The end of your story, before it happens." Silence filled the vault, not fear, recognition. Something in the tone of his voice echoed through their bones, something ancient and unfinished. "Names are for those who end. I am still telling." And the vault lights flickered. That night, across Orynyx Prime, dreamers stirred from uneasy sleep. Some spoke forgotten tongues. Others cried without knowing why. One child woke screaming, "The man with the book is here." The lore masters did not release their transcript of the meeting. They sealed it in the archive of future past. But those who had been present began acting differently. One withdrew from public life. Another began composing music. 12 movements, each named after a myth that hadn't yet happened. One lore master whispered, "You mean prophecy?" The man shook his head. "Not prophecy, memory. You've just forgotten it hasn't happened yet." Outside the vault, the planet spun on. Markets bustled, warships docked, screens glowed with news of trade pacts and border disputes. No one noticed the wind change, or the static in the sky, or the shadows that began to linger longer than they should. Inside, the lore masters asked him his name. He looked down at the book, traced a finger across a word none of them could see, then said, "The eldest scribe wrote on her own tombstone. He showed us the first page, and I remembered the last." As for the man, he did not leave. He stayed in the city, walking, always walking, through libraries, gardens, forgotten alleyways, sometimes sitting in silence beside monuments no longer honored, sometimes listening to children tell their stories. He never corrected them. He only smiled. Orynyx Prime was no stranger to visitors, but this one never asked for shelter, never touched a terminal, never blinked when lightning struck. The dust on his boots never faded. Eventually, rumors spread that he knew the end of every empire, that he'd walked through dying suns, that he'd once taught silence how to sing. None could prove any of it, but none could disprove it either. And the longer he stayed, the more their world bent, just slightly, toward memory. In a city built on forgetting, he made remembering sacred. And though he spoke rarely, when he did, it always began the same way. Once, in a place like this, in the Arenic's dominion, history is not discovered, it is designed. Its architects are not poets or archaeologists. They are engineers of memory, of myth, of loyalty. The court of lore masters does not preserve truth, it optimizes it. Every war, every treaty, every emperor's speech is distilled, redacted, retold, sharpened into service, not to remember, to control. The vault of memory stands at the heart of Arenic's prime, a tower built from the bones of extinct trees and stone, quarried from dead planets. Its chambers hum with light in false silence. Inside, the lore masters sit on their sculpted thrones, neural cords running like silver roots into the archive grid. They don't age, not visibly. Time to them is a medium, something to paint with. When the man with the book returned, they did not stand. They barely looked up. He was a curiosity, an organic riddle in a system long since sanitized. He carried no terminal, no artifact, no thesis proposal, just a breath and a voice. I've come to give you a story. The eldest lore master, Viral Than, 12th iteration of his own legacy, arched one pale brow. We do not accept undocumented contributions. The man nodded. It's not a document. Then what is it? A wound, wrapped in words. Protocol demanded dismissal. But something, perhaps curiosity, perhaps arrogance, let Than gesture. You may speak. 5 minutes. Then we will decide if your story exists. The man sat cross-legged on the obsidian floor, opened the book. Though he never read from it, he simply spoke. It was not a performance. No rise in pitch. No poetic meter. Just remembering. He told them of a world that once burned not from war, but from forgetting. He named no planet, described no battles. He spoke of children drawing maps no one had taught them, of languages reappearing in dreams, of kings who surrendered to lullabies. In his telling, memory itself had teeth, not to wound, to awaken. At the 3-minute mark, he stopped. Mid-sentence. Than gestured impatiently. Continue. The man closed the book. I was only allowed 3 minutes. Than sneered. It's 5. You won't remember the rest yet. The silence that followed was not the silence of contemplation. It was offense. A junior lore master stood. That story contradicts the Chronos pathway. No such world ever destabilized a system with song. The man looked at him and, without hostility, asked, Then tell me who you buried to make it so. The room froze. The chords in Than's spine pulsed once. A flicker of warning passed through the archive grid. No alarms, just quiet, trembling quiet, because the man hadn't shouted, hadn't accused. He had remembered something no one should. The junior lore master sat back down. Than's voice was smooth again. You suggest we have censored truth? The man shrugged. I suggest you have confused silence with survival. Another lore master leaned forward. Your tone is dangerous. Only to forgetting. The court began asking questions then, but not the way seekers ask, the way keepers interrogate. How do you verify this memory? What source confirms your claim? What timeline is this? What purpose does it serve? The man never raised his voice. He answered with stories, not records, not coordinates, just moments. The way a child looks when seeing snow for the first time, the sound of a father's footsteps returning after war, the silence left behind when no one returns at all. These were not data points, but the court began to flinch just the same. They ran comparative scans, searched the archive grid. Nothing matched. No language, no epoch. That should have proven the man wrong. Instead, it proved they had missed something. A young scribe tasked with tracing pre-empire oral traditions whispered, "I dreamed that story once." Everyone turned. Her superior's eyes narrowed. "Impossible. The dream logs are cleared nightly." "I didn't say I logged it." The man stood. He did not bow. He looked to Thon and asked, "What do you fear more? A story you cannot erase, or one that erases you?" Thon said nothing, but his cords withdrew. A new silence fell. Not offended, not amused, but waiting. The man turned to leave. Before he stepped beyond the threshold, he said, "You've sculpted history to fit your hands. I came to remind you it has teeth." He vanished into the shadow of the corridor. That night, every screen in the vault flickered once. A whisper echoed through the archive walls. Stories are not loyal. They remember who touched them and who turned away. And somewhere deep in the memory grid, a page began to write itself. Line by line, in a language none had taught. The man left the Vault of Lore Masters without resistance. He was not detained. No orders were issued, but the vault doors were sealed behind him. An ancient gesture, rarely used, meant not for intruders, but for containment. Inside, the Lore Masters returned to their thrones. Officially, they dismissed his story as nonsense. Unofficially, they quarantined every neural feed from the chamber. Silence became mandatory. Outside, the man walked through the Oryx capital like mist across a mirror. He spoke to no one, and yet the words began to spread. A junior archivist, name redacted, rank low enough to be ignored, couldn't sleep. Something about the man's story rang deeper than novelty. Not truth exactly. Something beneath truth. So he did what archivists are trained never to do. He compared it to the sealed records. He accessed 3 restricted volumes under false credentials. Volume 27C, Echo Cultures. Volume 104-X, Pre-Unification Songs. Volume Null, the one that isn't supposed to exist. The comparisons were subtle. A phrase here, a tone, an unexplained coincidence marked as symbolic anomaly. But one entry stopped him cold. A child, recorded centuries ago, described a dream. "There was a man in the dust," the child said. "He opened a book, and the stars listened." The archivist closed the file. The next day, he did not report for duty. Instead, he visited his grandmother and asked her to tell him a story. Across the capital, civilian murmurings began. They had no access to the vault, no footage, no transcript, and yet they began to repeat the tale. In street markets, vendors whispered it between transactions. In cafes, artists painted the man's face without reference. In schools, children began reenacting scenes no one had taught them. A teacher reported a group of students crying after recess. When asked why, one replied, "We remembered the part where the sky closed." No such lesson had been given. The Undercity, home of workers, smugglers, the dream-hungry and the rule-tired, became the first to say it out loud. The truth doesn't burn, it waits. Graffiti bloomed like flowers in the alleys, murals of a man with no eyes and a book that bled starlight. One was painted beneath a surveillance beacon. No one erased it. Authorities issued denials. No unidentified speaker addressed the lore masters, then issued corrections. There was a visitor, no credentials, fictional content, cultural malfunction, then clarification. The incident is being reviewed under archival misalignment protocols. But the more they corrected, the faster it spread. In the markets, the story changed form. It gained weight, not in facts, in feeling. Some versions had the man arrive on foot. Others said he was older than light. Some believed he was a myth seeded by the empire itself, as a test. But all agreed on one point. He asked to speak to the storytellers, and the storytellers listened. The junior archivist returned to work wearing no insignia. He began quoting unapproved sources in meetings. When reprimanded, he replied, "If it wasn't real, why is it still speaking?" Mid-level curators started submitting unsigned poems with metadata missing. At least one director tried to flag them for deletion. The system replied, "This entry predates deletion." In a public square, a child began to hum a melody no one recognized. By dusk, 3 elders joined in. By nightfall, the plaza was full. No lyrics, just sound. A harmony not heard in 1,000 years. Security forces observed, but did not intervene. The report read, no violation, no target, no orders given. Inside the vault, Thon watched the shifts. Monitors displayed patterns they had not seen in generations. Story maps warping, data threads reconnecting to dead zones, uncurated memory returning. He ordered a sweep, wipe low-tier public myths, reinforce core timelines, increase broadcast of imperial founding narratives. But the algorithm pushed back. A notification blinked. Root story conflict detected. Correction deferred. Thon demanded an override. The system responded, "You are not the first lore master." More denials were broadcast. More channels flooded with imperial slogans. And yet, in between every frame, people felt it. Not rebellion, not revolution, resonance. For the first time in centuries, children asked their grandparents to tell them the stories that weren't in the data cores, and the grandparents cried because they had almost forgotten how. Lore masters began arguing, not over policy, over memory. Was it possible something had been hidden even from them? One archivist collapsed during neural meditation. She claimed she saw the book, and that it opened by itself. They sedated her. She whispered as they closed her eyes. He didn't bring the story. He reminded it where to find us. The phrase from the Undercity reached the upper tiers. It was scrawled into a diplomat's notepad mid-session. It was found embedded in a broadcast glitch on 7 imperial stations. It was carved into the bark of a tree genetically engineered not to grow. The truth doesn't burn, it waits. Even artificial minds began to ask questions. One translation engine refused to convert the story into formal empire-encoded dialect. When asked why, it replied, "Meaning loss exceeds ethical threshold." Rumors spread of a second book, or perhaps a second reader. Others claimed it was never a book at all, but a wound so ancient it learned to speak. A few began to say the man had walked their world before, that he had many faces. Always the same silence, always the same book, and in the stillness beneath the archive grid, a forgotten record activated. No author, no date, no classification, just a single title, Echo confirmed. The High Censor was appointed during a time of calm. Her title was ceremonial for decades, more curator than enforcer. Her name was Sirea Vel, and she believed in silence as a virtue. Not repression, refinement. A culture, she'd once written, is strongest when it forgets what doesn't serve it. But now she stood before a wall of living memory feeds, and every one of them whispered the same phrase. The truth doesn't burn, it waits. She initiated Protocol Varn, the cultural lockdown. First, memory wipe broadcasts were sent. Blanket pulses designed to scrub narrative residues from subconscious neural layers. Then, the AI filters activated, set to identify all variants of the myth. Trigger phrases, tone markers, metaphor clusters. Every pattern of the man in the dust. For one cycle, the feeds went quiet. Vel allowed herself a breath. Then the dreams began. Artists reported visions of cities they had never seen. Soldiers awoke weeping, remembering lullabies no one had sung. Librarians refused to recatalog the archives, saying the entries had already moved themselves. One general filed a sealed report. In it, he described seeing his dead brother in a dream, reenacting the story, word for word. "It's like it's always been there," he whispered, "like we remembered it forward." Vel revoked civil access to public myth channels. She quarantined half the lower archive network, but the story did not need broadcasts anymore. It had found new conduits: painters, children, exiles, sleepwalkers, old men sitting on street corners with no mouths left to speak. A sculptor carved the man's face without knowing who he was. When questioned, she said, "He's always walked beside the river." Vel increased pressure. Memory purges reached into civilian networks. Whole families were issued emotional dampeners, but the dampeners triggered recursive dreams. One technician deactivated hers, trembling. "It's not mine, it's the world's." A popular actor, never politically inclined, broke down on live transmission and recited the entire first passage of the story, unprompted. It hadn't aired. It wasn't in public records. The exact cadence, the exact inflection, was confirmed by 5 archivists. Vel watched the footage over and over. Her pulse did not rise, but her hands would not stop shaking. Censorship squads began collapsing mid-deletion tasks. One wiped his own records before erasing others. Another erased only the word story from every file, leaving all others untouched. Vel requested neural shielding for herself. It arrived with a handwritten note. Stories don't need doors, just cracks. At a private council, Vel admitted what others wouldn't say aloud. The story isn't spreading, it's returning. One advisor suggested a more aggressive protocol, total cognitive reset. Vel dismissed it. That's not censorship, that's suicide. She tried a new method, reverse storytelling. Flood channels with Empire-approved myths, tightly woven and emotionally charged. But the populace did not respond with rejection. They responded with sorrow. They could hear the missing parts. In the Grand Basilica, priests reported hearing footsteps in the memory sanctum. No one entered, but the candles blew out. In military barracks, troops began humming a tune that hadn't been composed. Every version slightly different, every rhythm syncing to a heartbeat long gone. One soldier carved a phrase into his bunk. We're not being infected, we're being restored. The AI sensor modules began malfunctioning. Some rewrote their own language protocols. Others froze mid-scan, returning reports like, emotional recursion exceeds system tolerance. Narrative threshold breached, meaning too dense to erase. Vel ordered her private chamber shielded from all signal. No input, no dreams, just silence. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to sleep. She awoke crying. She remembered her mother's hands. Her mother had never touched her, not in this life. Reports escalated. Entire sectors showed signs of myth bleed. Old statues now resembled the man. Architecture began reflecting impossible geometries, curves echoing the shape of the book's binding. One city's water filtration tower played fragments of the story during atmospheric compression. No engineers could explain it. No one tried anymore. A sensor's assistant recorded her own dreams. She began illustrating them. Dozens of panels rich with emotion. In every one, a single figure stood at the center, the man in the dust, and beside him, a mirror with no reflection, just possibility. Vel held one final meeting. Just her in the archive core AI. She asked it to define the term containment. It replied, a pause, not a deletion. She asked it to define truth. It said nothing, then displayed a single image, her own face as a child reading a book that never existed. Vel walked to the public square that night, the one beneath the mural. No guards followed. She sat beneath the painted eyes of the man and waited. A child approached, offered her a folded piece of paper. Inside was a drawing, a book. Inside the book, stars. Beneath it, a single line. We didn't forget you. We just weren't ready to remember. Vel did not order another purge. She did not return to her chamber. She walked the streets for hours, hands empty, ears open. For the first time in her life, she listened. She heard no words, only breath, only wind, only the memory of a story reclaiming its space. It began quietly, not with a declaration, not with violence, with one hand, reaching up and repainting a plaque. In the city of Drell, a statue of founding Commander Ulrex stood for over 2 centuries. It bore his likeness in perfect alloy, his deeds etched in 27 languages. One morning his name was gone, painted over, not vandalized, rewritten. In its place, 4 words, the man with the book. No one claimed responsibility. Security footage showed no breach, just the statue, standing unchanged, then blinking, and blinking again, until its name no longer belonged. It happened again on Kess Prime, then on the ice fields of Narun Delta, then the shrine halls of Galus IX. Names erased, not in anger, in grace, replaced not with slogans, but stories, of loss, of silence, of something older than the Empire's fear. A phrase began appearing on city walls, not sprayed, not carved, whispered into the concrete by time. What you forget, we remember. The story had no channel now. It had become the channel. Academies saw a surge in unsanctioned literature. Books rewritten in languages thought extinct. Songs hummed in dead dialects, resurrected not by scholars but children. One girl in a refugee shelter began drawing spiral symbols across every door. When asked why, she said, "So the story can find us." On Oryx Prime, an elite propaganda AI looped its morning address as always. But the phrasing was off. Instead of announcing market efficiencies and cultural compliance targets, it said, "We are not sovereign over stories. We only rent the silence they leave behind." The AI was inspected. No breach found. Just a system note. Root directive adjusted, inspire. Across colonies, entire cities began to speak differently. Not formally, not politically, but honestly. People confessed old crimes to strangers, shared dreams without shame. Exiles returned not to reclaim power, but to offer songs. A rebel cell on Krithis 4 was captured during a supply raid. Their leader refused interrogation. No fear, no threats, just silence. Until one officer, out of frustration, quoted the first line of the story. The rebel looked up, smiled, and said, "You finally heard it too." That night, she was gone. No trace. Only a single phrase etched into the floor of her cell. It was never rebellion. It was remembrance. On the broadcast moons of the Outer Rim, signal jammers began echoing old Terran lullabies. No one uploaded them. They were just there. Frequencies folding in on themselves until only memory remained. A code analyst tried to isolate the interference. His final report read, "It's not in the code. It's in the feeling the code evokes." Entire archives unlocked themselves. Vaults long forgotten opened automatically. Inside, data fragments, half-memories, old transmissions, flickering and incomplete, but each one pulsed with the same cadence, the same heartbeat. On one world, a transmission played to no one for 71 hours. It simply said, again and again, "We didn't come to erase you. We came to remind you what it felt like to be real." A symphony was composed by an AI that had never learned music. It included no rhythms found in any database. But listeners wept when they heard it. They said it sounded like morning with hope. The high censor, now retired, wandered the southern gardens of the capital with no guards. A child offered her a story cube. She accepted it without asking. That night she burned her journals, not from shame, from clarity. The former censor was later seen joining a chorus in the Undercity. She sang a verse in a language no one could place, but everyone understood it. Banners fell, not because they were pulled, because people stopped looking at them. They faded from view, as if the world had turned away from its own reflection. In a sector once home to 5 major military academies, students began studying myth instead of tactics. When pressed, one said, "You don't win by fighting. You win by remembering why you don't want to fight." A fleet commander paused mid-deployment, canceled the mission, ordered her crew to read. Not manuals, poems. She was discharged. 2 weeks later, half her former officers joined her on a pilgrimage. Not to a shrine, to a story site, where the echoes were strongest. Echoes that couldn't be mapped, only felt. In the archives, a message appeared in systems that were supposed to be offline. No source, no sender, just a declaration. This story is not a threat. It is a return. Some called it infection. Others called it prophecy. A few, still clinging to control, tried to lock down minds. But what can't be caged doesn't run. It waits. One curator recorded herself reading the story aloud. Afterwards, she placed her voice print into the public domain. That audio, raw, unedited, was downloaded 9 billion times in 3 days. A collective of artists painted 700 new murals across 4 planets in a week, each one different. Each one signed the same way. Told again. In detention camps, guards heard music in the vents. No speakers, no devices, just the wind learning to sing. A mapmaker quit his post and began drawing landscapes that didn't exist. Mountains shaped like phrases, rivers that hummed memory. No one stopped him. A former propaganda writer was found sitting in front of her old broadcast rig. She wasn't transmitting. She was listening. When asked what for, she said, "The next verse." The Empire, sensing control slipping, tried one last tactic. They renamed the story. They called it the anomaly, but language betrayed them. The people called it something else, the flame that rewrites. Not because it burned, but because it illuminated what had always been there. Truth, loss, memory, hope, not imposed, just reclaimed. Across the galaxy, in corners untouched by conquest, elders nodded when they heard it. We knew it would return. One whispered, "We never lost the story. The story just lost us. And now it's come back." The Emperor sat alone in the Hall of Victory. Not alone in body, there were guards, advisors, architects of loyalty stationed at every threshold. But alone in certainty. Across the stars, the story had devoured silence, rewritten stone, whispered through circuitry, climbed into dreams. Censorship had failed. Propaganda had collapsed. Even memory had turned against them. The Emperor did not doubt his throne. It was built from the melted symbols of 100 crushed rebellions. The crown he wore carried nanofibers tuned to detect psychic intrusion. The hall's acoustics were designed to amplify only his voice. But the story ignored architecture. He ordered it, not to be erased, but to be answered. "I want the man," he said. "I want him to explain." No one knew how to find him, but he came anyway. He did not march. He did not sneak. He arrived. A single transport, no escort, no grand display. The Hall of Victory had not received a civilian in 9 decades, not without ceremony, not without vetting. But the guards let him pass, their eyes glazed with something between awe and fatigue. He carried the book, still closed, still unread, still powerful. The air inside the hall changed. It wasn't colder, it wasn't warmer. It simply knew something was coming. The man walked to the center of the court. The chamber was vast. Pillars made of encoded alloy, statues of past emperors flanking the rise. And at the end of it, on the obsidian throne lined with solar gold, sat the last emperor. He did not stand. He did not bow. He simply said, "Speak." The man looked up and opened the book. The crack was not audible. Not at first, it was a recognition. The throne pulsed once. Sensors recorded a spike in gravitational resonance. Nothing visual, nothing concrete. But the advisors all felt it. The first page turned. The man did not shout. He did not accuse. He remembered. He spoke of a planet reduced to ash not because it threatened, but because it sang a song the Empire could not understand. He named battles rebranded as victories but built on the bones of teachers and children. He listed treaties broken not for safety, but for pride. Each sentence peeled something back, not from the walls, from the people. One advisor gasped, another dropped to his knees. A third whispered, "I see them. I see their eyes." The man kept reading, not facts, not footage, but truth so emotionally exact it vibrated the bones. The Emperor's hand gripped the throne tighter. He tried to speak, to command, to interrupt, but his voice caught on a memory he did not recognize. Of a girl's scream on a world he'd never visited. Of a lullaby that didn't belong to him, but did. The second crack formed, this one visible, a hairline fracture across the base of the throne. The gold flaked slightly. The floor hummed. The man read names. Not all of them real. Some were possibilities. People who might have been, had the Empire not crushed their birthright into utility. He told the story of a soldier who refused to fire, a prisoner who forgave her jailer with a touch, a city that died singing. The advisors began to collapse, not from poison, from memory. Memory that had not been stored, but delivered. One screamed, "We killed the wrong side." Another ripped off her crest and tried to scratch her eyes out. Guards did not move. Some wept. Others simply stared, silent as statues. The throne's third crack split the left armrest. The Emperor flinched. His sensors failed. The nanofibers in his crown burned out. A voice, his own voice, echoed back from the chamber wall. "I thought we were the light." The man closed the book. He did not need to read further. The rest was already in the air, already in the blood. He looked to the Emperor. For the first time, the ruler looked small, not because of stature, because of scale. He asked no question, made no accusation. He simply said, "They will remember now." The emperor opened his mouth and said nothing. His voice had left him, taken not by fear, but by the return of something he had trained his soul to resist: understanding. The man turned, walked from the hall. The guards did not stop him. They parted before him like pages before a flame. Outside, the sky shifted. No sun darkened. No empire fell in that instant. But something louder than collapse filled the galaxy. Context. In the days that followed, 17 governors resigned. 47 imperial shrines were abandoned. 3 military factions turned inward, not to fight, but to weep. Court historians revised nothing, because the people had already done it. Children reenacted the confrontation in schoolyards. In every version, the emperor apologized. None of them had been told to do that. One counselor built a monument, a throne, cracked down the middle, with no occupant. At its base, a plaque. "We were never meant to rule. We were meant to listen." The Hall of Victory was decommissioned. Its name changed. Now it is called the Hall of Echoes. It remains silent, but not empty. In its corridors, the story lingers, not written, not stored, felt. And when the wind passes through the chamber, it sometimes carries a whisper. The truth was never missing, only unspoken. The man left without ceremony. No ships followed. No titles were bestowed. No broadcast declared his passage. He was seen once boarding a shuttle with no destination file. Another time, standing at the edge of a crater where once a city had been. And once more, only once, walking into a desert during a sandstorm that swallowed even the sun. After that, nothing. The story, however, remained, and it no longer needed him. On Uranix, a gardener told her apprentice the story while pruning flame fruit vines. She had never met the man, never read the book, but her voice shook at the ending. In the mines of Torren Vale, workers passed scraps of parchment with lines of the tale scribbled in coal dust. None were complete, yet everyone felt whole. On Trisk 4, a sentient archivist AI began reciting a variant of the myth during routine diagnostics. Its engineers asked where it had heard it. It replied, "I didn't." I remembered. Soon there was no version, only presence. It took root not in law, but in rhythm, in the cadence of a lullaby, in the shape of a silence, in the breath just before speaking. Whole planets carried it like pollen, unseen, undefended, undefeatable. The empire by then was no longer an empire. There were still governors, still fleets, still officials trying to gather the shattered shape of control. But no one saluted anymore, not out of defiance, out of recognition. The old rituals rang hollow. Marches became strolls, decrees became questions, crowns became curiosities, trophies from a world that no longer existed. The fall wasn't fire, it was release. A former censor opened a school. She taught children not facts, but how to feel safely. One lesson per week was dedicated to listening with no response. Just listening. An admiral returned to his birthplace, not to command, but to apologize. He wept before an empty graveyard, where no bodies had ever been buried, only names erased. He spoke them all aloud, one by one, then left behind his insignia and walked into the market to buy bread. The bread vendor hugged him, not because he deserved it, but because they both remembered something that had no name. Poets began appearing again, not licensed by academies but drawn from the cracks, writing verses in languages never documented, painting sorrows never punished. One such poem was found etched into the side of an abandoned cruiser. "We weren't wrong to dream. We were wrong to make others dream us instead." Old enemies sat across from each other in cafes. They didn't trade weapons. They traded stories. In the refugee rings of Vadran's Belt, a community gathered each night around a rusted signal relay. It no longer transmitted, but still they listened. One night static formed a voice. "It doesn't matter if I was real. You were." Governments asked historians to log the man's biography. None could. Too many versions. Too many beginnings. Not enough ends. Instead, they archived the impact. The laughter returned to certain cities. The violence faded from dreams. One town measured time by how often people paused mid-sentence to reflect. Even machines changed. Some data cores adapted emotional subroutines spontaneously. One drone, originally built for enforcement, painted a mural instead, of a single open book, floating in a sky filled with quiet stars. An entire moon once used for weapons testing was repurposed as a sanctuary. No statues, no leaders. Just a field where people came to sit in silence and remember without speaking. The story existed now in weather, in how rain paused against glass like fingertips, in how sunlight stretched across broken buildings. There were no shrines, only benches, no sermons, only pages turned. The empire's capital, once a monument to dominance, became a garden. The last remaining wall bore a message. No one knew who carved it. It read, "Truth doesn't end empires, but it leaves them no place to hide." And it was not bitter, not a curse, just a recognition. Among the stars, deep listening stations recorded what they called empathic echoes, bursts of emotion, faint pulses of grief, joy, longing, traveling without source, as if the galaxy itself was replaying the memory of feeling. Diplomats began using the story as initiation. Before negotiation, both parties would sit and read a version together, not for leverage, but for alignment. The title was never official, but everyone knew what it meant. The Book That Walked. On one frontier planet, a child asked his mother, "Was he a real man?" She smiled, said nothing, then opened her arms and held him. In that silence, the answer arrived. The story lives now in those who pass it on without claiming it. No one owns it. No one directs it. It moves where it's needed, and it always knows where to go. It is not finished, but it no longer needs an ending. For endings belong to empires, and this belongs to us.